episode of Multifamily Monday. My name is Jesse Greer, and I am the Vice President of Multifamily Investments here at Avis & Young. Today, I have a very special guest with me, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining me.
How are you?
Good, thank you. So we're going to have a fun conversation that talks about really the whole crux of this multi-part series that we're putting out. And it is in regards to seller financing or alternative financing. And the reason why I thought it'd be a good idea to bring this out to the public is because lending is very difficult right now. A lot of borrowers are finding that most lending institutions have really dried up when it comes to the properties that they're lending on and the loan to value. So what you're finding is more of an adjustment for seller financing or alternative financing. So part 2 of this series, I get to interview Elizabeth Fowler. And we're going to talk about promissory notes and deeds of trust and why they are important and how to structure them. But before we get started on that, Elizabeth, I'd love to hear a little bit more about you and what Fowler Law does.
Thanks, Jesse. I appreciate that. Well, as you said, my name is Elizabeth Fowler, and I am an attorney, and my practice is based here in Reno. I have my own law firm, so I am the owner, and my area is commercial real estate. That's pretty much all I do. I do some entity formation when clients need that because of their real estate transaction. And I do miscellaneous contract work and some other types of work, but the bulk of what I do is commercial real estate. And included in that is residential subdivision type work. And then the other thing I do is, or I say, when people, even in residential real estate, when people need, easements, driveway maintenance agreements, cost sharing agreements, a lot of residential type properties need that as well. So I'll do a lot of that too.
Fantastic. And really, I would consider Elizabeth the guru here in town. She's involved in quite a few organizations, really donates a lot of her time to NAIOP, for example, the Government Affairs Committee, and is really involved with a lot of the escrow and title companies as well in helping coordinate deeds of trust and promissory notes, in addition to working, of course, with clients. So tell us a little bit more about really your involvement in these organizations, because I think that is huge when it comes to finding the right attorney, knowing that they're not a generalist, but they specialize, like you said, in commercial real estate.
Right. Well, I am very involved in NAIOP. It's NAIOP Commercial Real Estate Development Association, and we have a chapter here in Northern Nevada. We've been going now for, I think, 14 or 15 years or so. I will actually be the president of NAIOP next year.
Congratulations.
And that's one organization I'm very involved in. The other organization that I'm involved in is the Commercial Real Estate Women's Group of Northern Nevada, CREW. And one of the main reasons why I am involved in NAIOP and CREW, and what I think it's so important to be involved, is it helps me learn more about my clients, which helps me become a better lawyer. And it helps me learn more about the boots on the ground stuff that I don't always get when I'm sitting in my office, writing a contract.
It's sense.
That real life, practical information that I think those organizations really bring to me, and which I'm so grateful to be involved in them for that reason and for a lot of other reasons. I'm also involved in the State Bar. I serve on the Executive Committee for the Real Property section of the State Bar of Nevada, and that's been another great resource for me to stay educated and stay connected.
Fantastic.
I just think it's super to be involved, and it just helps you professionally.
Continuing education and the ability to get out there and, like you said, really see what's going on in the industry. Yeah. So I think that's a good segue actually into the conversation for today, which is really promissory notes and deeds of trust. If you're in a position to where you're looking for seller financing, or let's say alternative financing, not only negotiating the terms of the seller financing, but alternative financing, it's equally important to understand what needs to go into the deed of trust and promissory note, because they are 2 separate documents, and I think there might be some confusion behind it. So maybe you could elaborate on really what the difference is between the two and what type of language you traditionally see go in each one.
Okay. Well, the difference between the 2 documents are very different. The first document, a promissory note, is at its core just a promise to pay. So it's a promise to pay by one party to the other party to whom the money is owed. It's really as simple as that. It's usually just signed by a single party. Okay. It's signed by the party that has made the promise to pay. The deed of trust is like a mortgage. It's not exactly, it's not a mortgage, but think of it in that sense in terms of your own, mortgage on your home. A deed of trust is the document that grants the lender the security in the real estate, along with security in rents that come from the real estate,
Okay.
and perhaps other personal property associated with the real estate.
What are some examples of that?
Let's say you have a multifamily project,
Mhm.
and there is a microwave in the kitchen.
Appliances,
And,
yeah.
and that's owned by the owner of the apartment complex. It's not an appliance, it's owned by the person that lives in that apartment. That is an example of a piece of personal property that a lender would want to be secured in, so that if they ever had to take the property back, they could take that appliance as well. Or washer and dryers, in a multifamily building. Of course, some of those are leased, but those are the kinds of things that would be personal property. Other things would be, plans, building plans. That's a form of personal property that a lender would want to make sure they have a security interest in case they ever had to take the property back.
Fascinating.
So the promissory note is just a promise to pay. The deed of trust is the instrument that creates the security for that note, given to the lender.
So let's talk about the promissory note real quick, because really, those are traditionally terms that a lender and borrower would agree upon, of course, before coming to you, or maybe they would be in negotiation as they're talking with you to start drafting the promissory note. What are some of the basic terms of a promissory note that go into it?
Okay, well, the basic terms are the amount of the loan,
Mm-hmm.
how much are you borrowing, that's one of the key terms. What is the interest rate on that loan? When are the payments to be made, and what kind of payments? Are they interest only? Are they principal and interest? Are the payments monthly? Are the payments quarterly? Or maybe there's no payment until the maturity date, at which point in time everything has to be paid.
Got it.
So
Okay.
you have to have a description of the payments. There typically is a clause relating to what happens if the borrower does not pay on time.
Mhm.
Is there a late fee? Does default rate interest start accruing? There usually are provisions that talk about what is an event of default under the note.
So Elizabeth right now is trying to give away one of my series. I like it though. Let's continue with it. We actually are going to have a foreclosure trustee come on here as well, so we'll talk about that in more detail. But that's a great point.
Right. What is an event of default, and what are the remedies? A lot of the remedies you'll see more so in the deed of trust than in a simple promissory note. Usually in a promissory note, you'll find language that protects the lender that says, I'm not waiving any rights no matter what happens. Things like that.
So what are some of the more, I'd have to say, kind of bizarre or not normal requests from either a lender or a borrower that you've seen and put actually in an instrument?
Well, a lot of times when I get, a request that is out of the ordinary, sometimes it's not something that I feel I can put in the documents.
Okay.
So for example, a lot of people will come to me and say, hey, this lender and borrower are buddies, and they've decided that they don't want to worry about any kind of foreclosure or anything like that. If the borrower can't pay, they're just going to give the property to the lender.
I see.
And you can't do that in the state of Nevada because of something called the one action rule, and that would not be enforceable. When you have a promissory note, when you have a loan that's evidenced by a promissory note that's secured by a deed of trust, the lender's first recourse has to be to foreclose on the property and take the property back.
Got it. That makes sense.
And the borrower can't waive that right, no matter what the parties say.
Okay.
So that's one of the things.
So irrespective of your buddies, you still got to follow the letter of the law.
Right. So that's actually a request that I get a lot of.
Really?
A lot of times, and
Okay.
I have to explain that. I don't feel comfortable putting that in the document because it's just not enforceable. And the other thing that I do get inquiries about is, hey, we want to change something down the road about this deal. So can we just put something in the documents that says that at some later date we're going to agree upon something different?
So vague terminology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but the key there is a provision that says, well, we're going to agree later.
Okay, I see, at a
Which-
future date.
Which it's not enforceable either. So
Yeah.
that's something that I typically dissuade people from putting in the documents as well. So those are two examples.
Fascinating. And ironically enough, Elizabeth and I came, I think, across a third example that was pretty fascinating, actually. I was pretty impressed with the request on this language from one of my clients is he was willing to carry paper for the borrower / buyer, but he said, look, with the political climate that we're in right now, I'm nervous that capital gains might change, right? And if I'm still carrying paper when capital gains do change, then I have a higher tax liability, which means that for me, carrying paper would cost more in the long run. So he actually put in language, and I'm sure you can expand upon this, talking about if capital gains change, the base rate of which he would have to pay normally, the borrower would have to pay the difference in the new capital gains rate.
That's right. We did put that language in there, and the key to that was simply trying to understand what each side wanted, and then making sure that each side was reviewing the language carefully and that it reflected what the intent was. That's the most important thing.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So needless to say, you can really be very creative in what you're putting into these documents. So we talked about the promissory note. Now let's dive into some of the sections of the deed of trust that are important.
All right. Well, the deed of trust is set up to be basically a grant of a, in trust to a title company or an escrow company who is the trustee under the deed of trust, to basically be the beneficial owner of the property until the loan is paid off. Mm-hmm. So it's a grant in trust to the trustee for the benefit of the lender until the loan is paid off, and that's a grant of the property, and that is the real estate security. That creates the security for the loan in the real estate. And then you'll find other language in the deed of trust which talks about the borrower granting to the lender a security interest in other personal property that we just talked about before.
Correct.
You'll also see the assignment of rents in that deed of trust. Rents are a big piece of collateral for a lender.
Absolutely.
And assignment of rents is governed by Nevada law. There's a big chapter in our Nevada revised statutes that govern how you do assignments of rents and how you enforce those provisions in the deeds of trust. But that also is in the deed of trust. Other provisions that you see in the deed of trust is obligations on the borrower about how they're to maintain and operate the property.
A certain level of standard, right?
Correct.
Now,
standard of care. You'll see insurance provisions, what insurance they have to have. Sometimes you'll see that in a separate loan agreement. But if they're just doing a note and deed of trust, then that's typically going to be in the deed of trust. There'll be provisions about, that the borrower can't sell the property. That would be a default.
Or if they do sell the property, then they have to pay the loan off, right? Or is it just...
well, if they sell the property, if that is in fact a default, then the lender would have the ability to accelerate the debt and basically call the loan.
Understood.
So you'll see those provisions in there. The deed of trust obviously is usually a much longer document than the promissory note, and it has more of the guts of what the borrower has to do.
Fascinating. So you mentioned maintenance.
It's not that fascinating.
Well, I think it is. I mean, that's just me. I don't know. So when you look at the deed of trust, and you mentioned a couple different provisions, right? One of them is maintenance. And I want to bring this up again because I do think it's important, right? If you're going to sell your property and you want to make sure that it's well maintained, in other words, you don't want to take back a property that has $300,000 worth of deferred maintenance or whatever that number might be, right? So what are some of the sample language, or what would typically a lender / seller want to see in that maintenance section to make them feel comfortable?
It varies from party to party and from transaction to transaction, but basically you want some general standard language that they're going to keep the property in good condition and repair, that they're going to comply with all applicable codes and ordinances, no violations of the building codes and all of that. And then the lender's going to want a right to inspect that property. They're going to want a right to come on and make sure that basic maintenance is being taken care of. I don't see in deeds of trust the real in-depth language that you might find in a lease, say, for example, where in a lease you're going to have a landlord wanting specific provisions in there about getting an HVAC contract and having HVAC maintenance and how that's supposed to happen quarterly or whatever.
Okay.
I typically don't see that level of detail in a deed of trust. It's more generalized, maintenance.
But it's not to say if you wanted it, you could put it in.
You
right?
could. You certainly could put it in. Yeah.
Okay.
What else is in a deed of trust?
So let's talk about insurance. You mentioned insurance as well. Are there traditionally standards that lenders, property owners, or alternative lenders like to see in there? I mean, what is something that is in the norm?
In the norm would be primarily a listing of the types of insurance. So, property insurance, liability insurance, maybe business interruption insurance. Do you need flood insurance?
Sure.
Depending on where the property is at. So basically, there's going to be a laundry list of the types of insurances that the borrower is going to have to carry. I find that in seller financing, where you're dealing with private parties are not going to know so much about that perhaps, and so I always recommend to them on the lender side to be sure to get that, be sure to talk to your insurance agent about what they recommend and make sure that you're complying with their recommendations.
Yeah.
I actually recommend that the borrowers do the same. When the borrower gets a deed of trust and there's this insurance language in there, they should be sending that to their insurance people as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very important point, because with one of the last transactions that we did that had a seller financing provision, insurance was a big component to it for obvious reasons. What you have to be conscientious of is when you work with the insurance agency, you're working with a third party again. So manage your time frame appropriately to understand that insurance brokers need, a good week to 2 weeks to shop it out and get you the best deals out there. So as you're managing the seller financing process, that could traditionally be another bottleneck in there. So that's an important
and the
point.
other important thing on that as well is once there is insurance and the borrower is sending the lender proof of that insurance, either through a certificate or whatever else, most of the time it's through a certificate, that should also be reviewed by someone with expertise to make sure that the certificate evidences what is supposed to be carried.
Got it. So is there any other words of wisdom or bits of advice as one goes out there and looks to potentially do seller financing with their property or look for alternative financing in today's very difficult market for lending?
About the documents, or
about the documents, about, like I said, promissory note, deed of trust. I mean, something that you just say, hey, this is another thing to keep an eye on as you move forward with that process.
Yeah, I think one of the main things that both parties to the transaction need to think about is, do they want to go to a lawyer for this service? I think that's an important consideration that they each need to think about. Or do they just want to try to, have these documents prepared through a title and escrow company? And the way that works is if you go to a title and escrow company and say, hey, we're going to do seller financing, here are the terms of the promissory note, can you put something together? What they're going to do is they'll probably go out to a lawyer who does documents, not representing either party. They're just acting as a scrivener, a document preparer for the title and escrow company, and that's how they will get those documents prepared. In that case, what typically happens, at least in my experience, is the parties to the transaction, the borrower and the lender, they don't get to talk to the lawyer. They're just talking to the escrow folks. So if you want to know about what clauses mean, if you have specific concerns about what goes into these documents, then you really ought to consider having that work done through a lawyer, where you have an attorney-client relationship with that lawyer who can listen to your concerns and make sure the documents are crafted in such a way that those concerns are addressed.
And I think that's a very good point, because quite frankly, you can go to an escrow and title company to get the promissory note and deed of trust established by them working with, for example, someone like yourself. But what I typically find is that most clients aren't at the sophisticated level legally to understand the whole dynamic behind it. So, even though you might be a little bit more cost effective with escrow and title, I think it's well worth, what it might cost to go to someone like yourself to really have that one-on-one, that personal touch that you would provide, And that's quite frankly one of the reasons why I wanted to interview you. I mean, as you can see, of course, you're very humble. You're like, no, just go to the escrow and title or work with me. But that being said, if someone did want to work with you, which I'd highly recommend, how do they get a hold of you?
Well, I can be found on the internet pretty easily. My email address is elizabeth@fielderlaw, LTD, like LarryTomDavid.com.
And how do you spell Fielder?
Fielder.
Perfect.
Like
And we're going to put that
Fielder.
information on here as well, so they'll have access to that.
Yeah.
So Elizabeth, once again, thank you very much for your time, and I'm sure if anyone out there has any additional questions, we'll make sure they're able to get a hold of you, and we appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. I appreciate being on.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
You too.
All right.